Satan is tempting me too well tonight. The lectureship committee has a sense of humor. The title of Brother Maze's lesson, Jacob's Wives. We'll let you think about that for a moment. But we're very thankful for Nathan and his work that he has been doing. He's a 2018 graduate of the West Virginia School of Preaching, and he is the minister at the Zelienople Church of Christ, which is just north of Pittsburgh and Harmony, PA. He has a great love for young hearts and does a great job teaching at various camps and encouraging young men to stand up and to proclaim the gospel of Christ. And we are thankful for that. And if you haven't quite caught on to the lectureship joke yet, he is unmarried. So he's going to talk about Jacob's wives. We appreciate you, brother.
Stole my opening joke. Good afternoon. As we have been seeing throughout our study on the book of Genesis so far this week, God in these pages through Moses sets out in written record the origins of Israel, the origins of his people. As he reaches out to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, and to others with covenants, with blessings, with promises. Some of these, as we have already seen and will continue to see through this week, respond with immediate faith. Like Abram, when God called him out of his home country, immediately Abraham was ready to go. Immediately Abraham answered. He answered in faith. We read in Genesis 12, verse 5, that he took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people whom they had acquired in Haran, and they departed to go to the land of Canaan. Abraham is not perfect by any means. We see a few times stories recorded about him where he acted in ways that certainly could not be entirely pleasing to God, where he lied about his wife to a couple of foreign dignitaries. But largely, we see Abraham's life defined by tremendous faith. Isaac, who we read very little about in the book of Genesis, we don't get a whole lot of details about his life, but similarly, we see he stumbles in a similar fashion to Abraham, but we also see him praying faithfully for his wife Rebekah to be able to conceive and bear children. We see great faith in both of these men. Jacob, after them, is also called faithful. But unlike with Abraham and Isaac, his faith is not as well demonstrated through much of what we read about his life. A lot of what is recorded about Jacob's life and his relationship with God, his faith, it would probably best be described as weak at best. Instead, we see Jacob deceive his family members, as Ed Malott described to us earlier today. Deceive his family members to secure a blessing and a birthright for himself. We see him place conditions on his faith in God. In Genesis 28, verses 20 and 21, Jacob made a vow saying, "If God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. And this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will give a full tenth to you." This statement from Jacob, by the way, is progress for him. This is a positive movement for him, but still he's saying, all right, we'll see. If God is faithful to me, then I'll throw in on his side. Then I'll obey him. Then he will be my God. Jacob does not fully give his faith to God for most of what we read about him. Jacob's relationship with God seems to be largely transactional. Though he acknowledges God's blessings when they come, he doesn't place his trust fully in God, at least not yet. But God continues to reach out to Jacob, continues to extend his hands toward Jacob, to call him to a closer relationship. God is always extending his hands to us, seeking to bring us into a right relationship with him through his grace and mercy. That is precisely what we see in Jacob's vision of the ladder descending from heaven, God reaching down from heaven to Jacob to say, I am your God and you will be my people. I will bless you and you will follow me. And I won't step on Mike Vestal's toes any further than that. God is reaching out to Jacob in these chapters that I've been assigned here in Genesis 28, 29, and 30. Throughout the book of Genesis, though, God chiefly reveals himself through these patriarchs, through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, through the head of these families. That is how God designed it. It's how he spoke to his people at this time. And when these families were structured the way that God wanted them to be, when they followed God the way he commanded them, that faith would be passed on from the father down to the rest of the family. That was God's design for the family, and it was the way that he designed this faith to be passed on. But we don't always see these great men of faith following God's design perfectly. And that is certainly not the case with Jacob. As Jacob is fleeing from his home because of the things that he's done to his brother Esau, Isaac, his father, gives him a charge. In Genesis 28, verse 2, Isaac says, "Arise, go to Padan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and take as your wife from there one of the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. Go to this place where we have family, and take from there a wife of one of the daughters of Laban." One of the daughters. You may have noticed the title of this lesson is Jacob's Wives, because Jacob takes two wives from the daughters of Laban. Jacob takes two. And this causes a lot of problems for him and for his family. And perhaps you think I'm being too pedantic and drawing this distinction between Isaac's charge for him to go and find a wife, one of the daughters. But it's the same distinction that Paul makes in Galatians chapter 3, verse 16, where he focuses in on the singular form of a word from this same book. When God, in covenant promise to Abraham, speaks of an offspring, Paul looks at that singular form and says, this word right here in this promise is Jesus, the singular offspring of Abraham. The distinction I'm making with Jacob's wives is perhaps not quite so significant, but I do think it's important. From the beginning, as Jesus outlines in Matthew chapter 19, from the very beginning, God's intention and design for the family was one man and one woman. In taking these two wives, as we'll see Jacob do in just a little bit, Jacob departs from God's perfect design for the family. And the result of that decision is strife and pain and sorrow. Now, you would be right if you're thinking that Many others in Scripture are seen taking multiple wives. And in those moments, we don't see God step in and condemn those actions. But we should also recognize that when God sets forth a pattern, He expects it to be followed. We should also recognize that God, in His Word, will frequently describe actions which we can recognize as being sinful without stepping in and letting us know, hey, by the way, guys, that's sinful. One of the examples of this that always comes to my mind is the Danites in Judges chapter 18, where they sweep in and take some household idols and go and establish a new location for the tribe of Dan to settle and establish a new priesthood. And God doesn't have the writer pause for a moment and say, remember guys, idolatry is sinful. And establishing another priesthood not of the tribe of Levi is sinful. He doesn't need to, because He's already established the law and established the pattern. We can read that passage and recognize that it is a departure from God's will, a departure from His law. And similarly, as we read about Jacob and his family, we should recognize that there is a departure from God's design. We might balk a little bit at the idea of God's people, His covenant people, His nation, being formed out of a relationship that is so embroiled in sin. But this wouldn't be the only example of that. In the genealogy of Jesus our Lord, we find others of similar report. Of she who was the wife of Uriah, of Rahab the prostitute. God uses even very sinful situations to bring His Son, Jesus, into the world. God frequently works through sinful situations. God does later in His law condemn precisely the relationship that Jacob has as he is married to both Rachel and Leah. In Leviticus 18:18, God says, "Nor shall you take a woman as a rival to her sister, to uncover her nakedness while the other is alive." It should be plain to us that this relationship between Jacob, Rachel, and Leah is not one that follows God's design, and it is not one that is pleasing to Him. We don't need to deny this departure from God's design for the family to see God working in them. God's will is not impeded by the sinfulness of man. As we read in 1 Corinthians 1:27 and 29, God has chosen the foolish things of the world to put to shame the wise, that no flesh should glory in His presence. Because it brings God even greater glory to work through those things which are weak and sinful. God does not need the use of human hands, but He blesses us in that He allows us to be a part of His great work. And so, God blessed Jacob and Rachel and Leah in allowing them to be a part of bringing about this great nation, Israel, through which God would bless the whole world. And so it is that we find Jacob searching for a wife among his mother's people, just as his father Isaac had instructed him. And God providentially leads Jacob to a well, where he encountered some shepherds who told him that Laban's daughter Rachel was approaching. And as soon as Jacob sees Rachel, he starts showing off. He sees Rachel coming and he says, "Move, guys. Get out of the way. I'm going to lift this stone from the well." This is something that normally would have taken at least 2 men to accomplish. I'm not saying by any means that this was a miraculous feat of strength from Jacob, but certainly it would have been impressive. He starts showing off for Rachel, and he goes and he waters her entire flock. I think it's safe to say that Jacob here is smitten at first sight. And as we saw earlier today, there are some similarities between this and an earlier story in the book of Genesis. Both Jacob and Abraham's servant met the women that they sought at a well. But the similarities largely end there. Abraham's servant, as he approached the well, prayed to God for guidance. And he prayed to God in worship and thanksgiving when he had found the woman. In contrast to that, Jacob relies on his own strength. He navigates for himself to this well. And when he sees the woman that he wants to marry, he relies on his own strength to make a good first impression. And he doesn't offer up any prayer of thanks. But despite this disparity in the faith of these two men, God still guides each of them to the right place at the right time to meet the woman that they were sent to meet. After this meeting, Jacob stays with his uncle for a month, presumably working for Laban and spending time with Rachel during that period. And after that month period, Laban encourages Jacob to name his wages. Tell me what I should pay you. I think it's safe to say here that Laban is fully aware of Jacob's intentions toward his daughter Rachel. Jacob isn't exactly being subtle about it from the very start. So Laban knows what Jacob has in mind here. Jacob offers to work for 7 years for Rachel's hand in marriage. He didn't come with any riches or wealth as he fled from his family, as he fled from his brother Esau. So he comes empty-handed, but he says, I will work for you, uncle, for 7 years in order to marry your daughter Rachel. Now, according to Whitworth and some other scholars, the average bride price at this time would have been around 30 to 40 shekels. And the yearly wage for a laborer would have been about 10 shekels. So if you do the math there, typically the average price that one would have offered here would have been 3 to 4 years' wages that Jacob would have to work for his uncle Laban in order to take Rachel as his wife. That would have been an appropriate payment here. And why Jacob offers these 7 years, we can only speculate. Maybe he was unaware or foolish regarding what the actual wages were, though I think that's unlikely. Perhaps he was just that desperate, knowing that he was coming with nothing. That's possible. Or maybe he was just trying to show how much he valued Rachel. I'd put my money on that one. Whatever the reason that Jacob offers nearly double the typical bride price for Rachel, Laban's response, as Jacob's family, should have been to counter with a more reasonable offer. Jacob is being extremely generous here, and Laban's response should have been generosity in return. But instead, Laban hears that and says, ooh, that sounds great. I bet I can take advantage of this kid. Years pass swiftly for Jacob as he serves these 7 years in order to win Rachel's hand because of his great love for her. And when that time comes, notice Laban does not come to Jacob and say, all right, you've served your 7 years, let's marry you guys. Jacob has to come to Laban and say, hey, by the way, 7 years are up. It's time for me to marry Rachel. And so Laban throws a marriage feast. And I think it's very plain that Laban's intention here is to entrap and defraud Jacob. Laban knows what he's doing and at no point communicates any problem to Jacob. He doesn't have any kind of conversation with him about this idea of the older sister being married before the younger, of Leah needing to be married before Rachel. Never communicates this to him. Jacob is clearly caught unawares. In Genesis 29, verses 22 and following, the way that God has this recorded for us by Moses, I think, invites us to experience the same surprise that Jacob does. Again, Genesis 29, starting in verse 22. So Laban gathered together all the people of the place and made a feast. But in the evening he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and he went into her. Laban gave his female servant Zilpah to his daughter Leah to be her servant. And in the morning, behold, it was Leah. And Jacob said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? Did I not serve with you for Rachel? Why then have you deceived me?" Jacob clearly wasn't expecting this. He is surprised. And certainly, we can be sympathetic with Jacob, who has worked for 7 years expecting to marry Rachel, the love of his life. And now he finds that he's married to her sister Leah, who, perhaps somewhat uncharitably, is described as not being quite as pretty, perhaps, as Rachel. But he confronts Laban about this and says, "We had an agreement." And Laban makes his excuses and says, "Look, all right, how about you work for me for another 7 years, and then you can have Rachel as well. But we'll go ahead and marry her to you now, and you'll pay it off later." And so after a period of a week, 1 week, in which Jacob is married to Leah, and Leah only, Jacob also marries Rachel and works another 7 years after. There is no mention around this marriage to Rachel of any wedding feast taking place. I suspect it is because there is no wedding feast here. Laban has just thrown one 1 week prior. You can't have another wedding feast so quickly after the other. It's simply not practical, I can hear Laban saying. And so Rachel does not receive the honor that she is due in this moment. And while we can understand why Jacob here chose to marry Rachel as well, I think we have to recognize that the most godly, the most righteous thing that Jacob could have done in this situation was remain married only to Leah. Would it have been easy? Would it have been pleasant? Not likely. But I think if that had been the decision that Jacob had made in that moment, I suspect God would have blessed him and blessed their marriage. I suspect God would have worked with them to bring a sort of love to that relationship that certainly is absent as things played out. All of the hurt and trouble that follows Jacob's family from here is the result of selfishness and a lack of faith toward God that is encapsulated in this moment. Disregard for God's divine design for the family leads to pain and leads to sorrow. And Jacob and Rachel chose to disregard that design because of their feelings for one another. And so the relationship between Jacob and Rachel and Leah is one that is defined by jealousy and bitterness. From this day, seemingly, until their deaths. None of Rachel or Leah or Jacob are sinless in the events that follow this. But I would say that Leah shows the most faith out of this group. God displays his grace toward Leah in Genesis 29, verse 31. When the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. God blessed Leah with 4 sons. because she was unloved, because she was hated, because she was so embittered by her relationship with Jacob, that Jacob loved her sister and did not love her. But God hears her cry and blesses her with sons. And we see in this chapter, in chapter 29 and chapter 30, the names that are given to the children of Jacob reflect the hearts of their mothers. There is some wordplay occurring with these different names, but thankfully God, through Moses, has kind of spelled things out plainly for us in revealing these hidden meanings to us. And so we don't have to be scholars of Hebrew in order to understand what's going on here and what's going on in Rachel's heart and in Leah's. 4 children Leah is blessed with at the start of this marriage. And as we read through Genesis 29, verses 32 through 35, I want you to watch for a progression in the ways that Leah names her children. I think there's progress happening with these 4 names. Genesis 29, starting in verse 32. Leah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Reuben. For she said, because the Lord has looked upon my affliction, for now my husband will love me. God has looked upon my affliction. He has seen my pain and my sorrow, and he has blessed me with a child. What faith Leah has. And notice that she hopes with the birth of this child, with the honor that is bestowed to her, an heir, the firstborn to Jacob. With this she hopes that her husband will now love her. But that is not the case. Verse 33, she conceived again and bore a son and said, because the Lord has heard that I am hated, he has given me this son also. And she called his name Simeon. Because he has heard that I am hated, God has blessed me with another son. Again, she sees the blessings of God in the birth of her children. Verse 34, again she conceived and bore a son and said, now this time my husband will be attached to me, because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore his name was called Levi. Surely God has blessed me again with another child, and surely Jacob now will love me. He will become attached to me. I have borne him 3 sons. With each of these first 3 sons, Leah's concern and hope is that through these births, through these blessings, Jacob might, maybe, turn his heart toward her in affection and love. With the 4th child, there is a change. Verse 35. And she conceived again and bore a son and said, this time I will praise the Lord. Therefore she called his name Judah. Then she ceased bearing. With the birth of this 4th child, we have Judah, named without any reference to her loveless marriage. With this 4th son, it seems that the love and grace and blessings of God have gotten through to Leah. And while she does not have the love of her husband, she recognizes she does have the love of God. This time, I will praise the Lord. As difficult as these years must have been for Leah, God was using them in order to draw her into a closer relationship to him. And we see that reflected in the names that she gives her 4 children. But just as Leah is tortured by a lack of affection, a lack of love, Rachel is tortured by a lack of offspring, something that was held to be in the highest of honor at this time. If you could not bear your husband children, what good were you? Rachel is feeling that weight and pain at this time as she sees her sister bearing son after son after son. And so in Genesis chapter 30, verse 1, Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children. She envied her sister and said to Jacob, "Give me children, or I shall die." And perhaps like Esau, she's being a bit dramatic. But instead of just hunger here, she's facing some very real cultural pressures and expectations, and probably some disappointment from Jacob himself. She is desperate and tortured. But Rachel does not go to God. She goes to Jacob. And Jacob, to his credit, does recognize God's sovereignty in this moment. In chapter 30, verse 2, Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, "Am I in the place of God who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" We can give him a little bit of credit there, though I don't think he's handled himself well in this situation. He recognizes God's sovereignty here, but he does not entreat him. He does not pray to God. Jacob's father, Isaac, once faced a similar situation with his wife Rebekah, when she was found to be barren and unable to conceive. And Isaac went and prayed to God that Rebekah might bear a child, and she did. Jacob makes no such plea. Jacob does not put his trust in God, as he seldom does in these early years. Rather than trusting God, Rachel, like Sarah, 2 generations before her, seeks to build a family on her servant's knees. And through her servant, which she offers to Jacob as a concubine, she bears 2 sons. Legally, they are her sons, but biologically, they belong to her servant. The names that Rachel gives these 2 children also, I think, reveal some of her heart. In chapter 30, verse 6, Rachel said, "God has judged me, and has also heard my voice and given me a son." Therefore she called his name Dan. Rachel sees in the birth of this first child through her servant Bilhah vindication and justice. Yes, God has seen that I deserve to have children just like my sister Leah, and I am vindicated in the birth of my son Dan. With Naphtali, her next son born to her servant, her focus again is on Leah. Chapter 30, verse 8, Rachel said, "With mighty wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister, and I have prevailed." So she called his name Naphtali. Here there is not even recognition of God's involvement in the situation. Simply that Rachel is oh so clever and deserving, and she has finally beaten her sister. One big happy family. Leah, seeing these children born to her sister's servant, gives in to jealousy and says, "Well, if Rachel can give you her servant as a concubine, I can do the same thing." And offers her servant Zilpah to Jacob as a concubine, through whom he bears 2 sons. And the names given to these 2 sons, I think, show a bit of a shift in Leah's attitude at this time. Reading in chapter 30, verses 11 through 13, Leah said, "Good fortune has come." So she called his name Gad. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a second son, and Leah said, "Happy am I, for women have called me happy." So she called his name Asher. 2 sons, 2 names, and neither of them a mention of God. Her focus, her trust has shifted now. Instead of again praying to God, instead of again pleading with him to reopen her womb, as God has already done before in demonstrating his kindness and goodness to her, she gives into that jealousy and follows her sister Rachel's footsteps. And she says that she is happier here, but she is not showing the same kind of faith. Rachel's sons, born of Bilhah, did not bring her satisfaction ultimately. She still wanted that biological child to be born to her, and so she turns to superstition. As Leah's son finds mandrake roots in the field, something that was said at that time to be an aphrodisiac, sometimes called love apples. Rachel sees these and wants them for herself. She sees in these possibly a solution to her barrenness. Still, she does not pray to God, but trusts in hokey religion. She bargains with the marriage bed as though it were a sheep to be sold at market. Genesis chapter 30, verses 14 and following. In the days of the wheat harvest, Reuben went and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes." But she said to her, "Is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also?" And Rachel said, "Then he may lie with you tonight in exchange for your son's mandrakes." When Jacob came from the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, "You must come in to me, for I have hired you with my son's mandrakes." So he lay with her that night. And God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. Leah said, "God has given me my wages, because I gave my servant to my husband." So she called his name Issachar. Here it seems Leah is again praying to God that he might open her womb, and God hears her cry and blesses her with another son. But notice that Rachel is the one who has purchased this aphrodisiac, these mandrakes, in order to conceive a son. And she does not. Instead, Leah does. Rachel did not conceive by the power of these mandrakes. Leah is blessed again by God with a sixth son named Zebulun and with a daughter named Dinah. In verse 20, Leah said, "God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will honor me because I have borne him 6 sons." So she called his name Zebulun. Still, Leah is wanting for the affection of her husband, is wanting to see some of that love that he pours out on Rachel, but leaves her without. After Rachel has tried everything else, she has tried pleading with Jacob as though that might accomplish something. She has given her servant as a concubine to Jacob that she might have legal children at least. She has tried looking to nonsense in the mandrakes in hopes to conceive a child. She's tried everything. So now finally she pleads with God, starting in verse 22. Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son and said, "God has taken away my reproach." And she called his name Joseph, saying, "May the Lord add to me another son." We know that Rachel here prays to God because we're told that God listened. And she is blessed with a son named Joseph, a significant name for the chapters to come. And indeed, she is blessed with another son, Benjamin, though in bearing him into the world, she passes from it. These chapters are a mess, and this family is a mess. There is pain and strife and sorrow throughout, and very little faith to be spoken of. But a little faith. Jacob very slowly places his trust in God. From these chapters forward, we see Jacob sort of beginning to see God a little bit more and more, until eventually he does place his trust, his faith in God, and names him as his God. but I'll leave that for some other speakers to follow. Jacob very slowly places his trust in God. In fact, he only, a few chapters after this, finally gets rid of the household idols that are so common to the era. But God still, throughout all of this time, blesses him abundantly with increasing wealth and with 12 sons who would one day grow to become the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob is slow to understand and he is slow to trust in God. He is slow to turn to him. But God is patient, working in the world and through this family to accomplish his perfect will and draw all men to him. He is patiently drawing this family into a closer relationship with him. Jacob's family certainly strayed pretty far from God's design for the family. As Israel, their descendants, would later stray from God's law and fail to serve as his light to the nations. One of the reasons that God so blessed Israel and gave them these laws is so that other nations would see how they are blessed, to see how they are obedient to the one true God, to be a light to the world. That isn't a new thing in Jesus' day. That has always been God's intention for his people. But Israel frequently failed in that purpose, instead becoming more like the nations around them. But in his patience and in his grace, God sent deliverers, judges, and prophets to call his people to him, to call his people to repentance, culminating in the arrival of his perfect deliverer, Jesus, his son. Because that is the purpose of everything he is doing here with Jacob and his family, is to bring his son, Jesus, into the world, to prepare the way for him. And even as Israel and Jacob and we today are sometimes slow to turn to God, it is God demonstrating his own love toward us, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Romans 5, verse 8. God demonstrated his love for Jacob and the whole world, in that while Jacob, Rachel, and Leah are sinning and departing from God's design for the family, God still blessed them and stretched out his mighty hand to draw them closer to his presence, to draw them into a right relationship with him, to show them his love, his grace, his forbearance, to show them a right way to live in a right relationship with him. In the same way, God today, with patience and grace and love, reaches out to each one of us and reaches out to the world through us. Even as we sin, even as we are slow to turn and slow to understand, God is reaching out in relationship to us. And he has done so chiefly through his Son, which he blessed the world through this family. Throughout the book of Genesis, we should see God reaching out to his people and through his people to the world, to draw all men to him. Thank you for your time this afternoon.